Hello again. This is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and on behalf of IPAA, we welcome you to another edition of our video library on environmental topics. I hope you look at our website and all the other videos that we've collected, from Quad OA and B to methane tax to PFAS to how to plug a well and the ramifications of that. So we've got a lot of good information. Please take advantage of that. This follows suit because I think this is a very interesting topic. We've had a press release that went out July 31 that kind of spurred this interest. We've got a couple of folks from the Environmental Defense Fund, Elizabeth Lieberknecht and Danielle Zavala-Araiza. We're going to be talking about methane air, which is their efforts to use aircraft to identify and quantify methane leaks within the United States. There's a heavy focus on the Permian, but it's really for the whole United States. Very happy to have them here. Elizabeth was a staff attorney for TCUQ for around 10 years, and now is in charge of the strategy and policy direction for the EDF in the Mid-Continent area. Danielle's coming from us all the way from the Netherlands, so he's almost at the end of his day, and has a PhD from the University of Texas. We've already, as you all know, I'm an Aggie, so we've already kind of made amends on that. But his focus was on shale gas production and the methane that came from that. Has been with EDF for quite some time, again, focusing on the mitigation of and the acceleration of methane leaks, and is in the office of the EDF's Office of Chief Scientist. So very knowledgeable on this topic. And Elizabeth, if you want to add anything else to that on kind of the intro, and then maybe give an idea of kind of where we are with this press release and kind of what y'all are trying to do.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Grant. Thanks for having us. Excited to talk about this really important data and, why we're excited about it. EDF is an international nonprofit with over 3 million members. We create transformational solutions to the world's most serious environmental problems by linking science and economics, law, and innovative private sector partnerships. We've been a leading force. EDF has been a leading force in driving global methane reductions by conducting extensive research on methane emissions, particularly from the oil and gas industry, and using this data to advocate for strong policies and industry practices aimed at significantly cutting methane pollution through research and advocacy efforts. And like you said, I'm a regulatory and legislative manager in EDF's energy transition focus area, where I advocate for improving rules governing oil and gas development and reducing its community, environmental, and climate impacts. And my work is focused in Texas and Louisiana. So I will turn it over to Danielle to talk about. As you mentioned, we released this summer a set of data from a methane air measurement campaign. And I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to add anything he'd like to on his background in methane measurement, and then start us off with an overview of the methane air campaign and what we found.
Very good. Thanks, Elizabeth. Danielle?
Yes, thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Grant, for the opportunity to engage on this important topic. So I've been at EDF for 10 years, and EDF has been working on methane for a little bit longer than that. And so one thing we've been doing from the science side of things is, we've started from the beginning with very simple, what seem very simple questions, which is how much methane is being emitted by different parts of the oil and gas industry across the supply chain? Where are the emissions coming from? And what do we need as we see companies and regulators making pledges and targets to reduce emissions? What do we need to monitor if emissions are going down, which is what obviously we want to see? And so a lot of the work has been going out into the field. It started in the US across the different oil and gas producing basins, going into the field and using, at the time, new sensors to detect these emissions and quantify it. And so over the past decade, Grant, as you can imagine, we've learned a lot about what to do it and what different type of information you get from different sensors. right? So you're going to get very different information from an infrared camera that what you're going to get from a drone. And it's not necessarily that one is better than other. It's not necessarily that one is silver bullet. It just depends what you're trying to do with information. If you're trying to quickly find a valve that it's leaking and you want to fix it, I mean, the infrared camera might be extremely useful. If
Right.
you're trying to map a massive production field in Texas so that then you can send personnel to the sites to fix things, I mean, maybe you start with a drone or another type of aircraft. So part of what we did with this quickly evolving monitoring opportunity is think carefully what would be the type of instrument that would be needed to provide data with enough accuracy globally in a way that then the different stakeholders could act on it, right? What it means is that the industry could use this information to improve their own monitoring systems, that regulators could track changes, and also that there's enough transparency for the public of what is the state of emissions and mitigation for the industry. And that's how Methane Sat as a project came to be. How can we design an instrument that we put on a satellite that we send to space to do this continuous mapping of emissions? And so something that is really important, and I'll get quickly to Methane Air, but something that's very important about Methane Sat is that it was designed to be fit for purpose for this specific activity. There's subtle other satellites out there that are collecting data on methane, very useful data, but I tend to say that a lot of the satellites resemble more like the Swiss Army knives, right? So they have several different characteristics, and so they're trying to serve different needs.
Sure.
And here Methane Sat is really going after this great opportunity to reduce global oil and gas emissions by 75%. So we designed that with mind. We put the instrument in space. We can talk about it in a second. But then we built a second instrument as the one that went to space. We put it on an aircraft with the initial goal of testing the instrument, just learning how it was collecting data, understanding how to improve the algorithms to process the data. And so that was the initial focus of Methane Air, flying it around regions to understand how the instrument works. As we started flying, we realized that the data that was being collected by Methane Air was so powerful in terms of resolution and accuracy that it could provide a reliable update on the understanding of emissions across the country for the oil and gas industry. And so what we did last year is fly Methane Air with the main objective now of mapping more than 70% of onshore US oil and gas production. So over a period, so over the summer, so from June to October 2023, we were flying it around the country. We flew it across, and Elizabeth, maybe this is a good point for context setting to show the map.
Sure.
But so we ended up flying Methane Air across 12 basins, the major 12 oil and gas producing regions in the country. And so that's what you see here. So the different basins, and then there's yellow, there's the yellow polygons which show the specific areas that Methane Sat flew. If you add all of those areas that Methane Sat flew, you will count for 70% of the US onshore oil and gas production, so the vast majority. And the other important thing is that within each of those basins, so we look at the Permian or the Barnett Shale in Texas or the Bakken, the yellow represents 80% or more of the production within each of those regions. So in the end, what the yellow is characterizing, or what Methane Air characterized, is the vast majority of production across each of those basins.
And looking at the map, Danielle, it's clearly from just the geographic standpoint of the basin boundaries you have, it's probably closer to 30%. But each basin kind of has a fairway, kind of an area where most of the production is. And so I assume y'all looked at that and identified where the predominance of that production is, and that's where y'all did your flyovers.
That is correct. So what Methane Air is flying is, imagine that it's doing this zigzag pattern, and it's covering a square of roughly 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers per day. And so we selected this 100 by 100 kilometers for the different basins in places that, as you say, Grant, they would maximize production. So we see this in the Permian, right? So there's these two central spots, one more on the Texas side, one more on the New Mexico side. And those yellow regions, I think for the Permian, it's actually more than 90% of the Permian production, what is captured on those 100 by 100 boxes. So
Okay.
the other thing to flag here, which we also get asked, is there's been a lot of work into how you get this type of regional estimates. And one concern is that if you just fly once, one day, the emissions are changing a lot with time.
Sure.
So you ask, was that really representative of the operations happening through the year? And so what's important to say about the methane sat is across the 12 basins, in pretty much every single case, this is more than one flight. So it's multiple flights that are analyzed to produce these estimates. It's still not the ideal. This is an initial illustration, and that's really where methane sat is going to provide a more systematic understanding, because methane sat has this frequent recurring data collection over every single basin. That's where we're really going to be able to stack images together and see the changes over time. But I think even now with Methane Air, with this initial set of results, it's still quite interesting in terms of what we're learning.
Danielle, and so between June and October, y'all flew over these areas 2 or 3 times, it sounds like?
I think in some cases, in the minimum would be 2. Some of the basins we flew 6 to 8 times.
Okay. And then just from a perspective of your methane sat, and I know that's really, the data is going to get released later on and really be more active in 2025. So how, as it stands and it's rotating through, how often will it be going around and getting this data? And
Yeah,
and it can be rough numbers. I don't know if that's really in your world, but I'm just trying to understand perspective of. It seems like satellite would be a lot more frequent because it's circling the country, but
yes. So I think so there. Yeah. So I think there's some important differences that start to talk about the the power of the satellite versus the aircraft, right? So the aircraft, again, we would fly this 100 by 100 boxes, and it would take us one day to cover that, right? So we would fly box 1 in the Permian one day, and then the next day we would have to do a different box,
right.
and so on and so forth. Methane sat is capturing targets of at least, roughly speaking, 200 by 200. So already significantly larger sizes, 200 by 200 kilometers.
Kilometers, okay.
And methane sat obviously is capturing several of those targets a day. And because it's constantly orbiting the Earth, I think we expect that every single of those targets is going to have a revisit more or less every 10 days,
Okay.
15 days. So you can see how it quickly adds up. If you're trying to understand what are the emissions of one of these production regions over a year, quickly adds up how many images you have to put together and understand how much they're changing.
Yeah, Danielle's described it before as almost like creating a movie, which I think is really helpful for me as a non-technical person. I mean, it's not like actually going to be moving images, right? But you kind of start to see like, okay, yes, it just passed over at this point in time, but you're building with the frequency of how often it's going over particular targets over time. You start seeing just a longer kind of and bigger picture of what the emissions profile is for those areas and how they're changing over time.
So frequency is very important and coverage area, but then the other aspect is resolution and comfort on the actual data that you're getting. In my little head, the closer to the wellbore you are, the more higher resolution. The further away you are, the less. Uh, Explain how that
Yeah.
fits in, and my sense also though is that the satellite stuff is just now starting, so it's going to get better as it goes along, but maybe that's not the case.
Yeah. No, that's so there. I think those are really good questions, and let's start on unpacking, because as you say, Grant, I think there's really important things to discuss there. So one is maybe let's start. Let me describe for a second the the type of data that
Sure.
that we are releasing, which is already available in the data platform for Methane Air, and we expect the same type of data from MethaneSat. And I'll use that as
And when you say you've released it, that's part of that July 31st press release.
so the what we released in July 31st is a press release which was summarizing the results, but now anyone can access via a link an interactive map, and
Oh,
you
okay.
can zoom in and zoom out, and we can share the link to that
Okay, thank you.
for the audience. So let me use the example from MethaneSat, Methane Air as an illustration, and then we talk in general about the state of the art of satellite and methane. So what you're getting from MethaneSat and Methane Air is three types of data, or three main threads of information. The first one, and this is where the summer release focused, is what is the total for a region, right? So for the Permian, and we can share a slide.
Should I go ahead and do that?
Yeah, let's show it
Yeah.
quickly. We can unpack the information there, but I think it's useful as an illustration. So what we mean for the first type of data, or the first result you get from the MethaneSat data, is for any of those 12 basins that we flew over several days, what are the total emissions? Right? So what you see here is they're ranked in terms of total emissions. So just all the sources in the basin, how do they contribute to a total? They get as high as in the Permian with almost 260,000 kilograms per hour, and as low as in the Bakken, which is just 12,000 kilograms per hour. So, I mean, we can talk more about this, but one thing you can clearly start to see with the totals is this very significant variability in emissions across the country. We show here also the intensity, which means the total emissions divided by production, in this case gas production. And of course, you also see a very significant variability there. You have places like the Pians in Colorado or Uinta that are at 7% or 8% of the production being emitted, and places like the Appalachian in the Northeast where it's just below 1%. So again, there's very significant variability. And in a short sentence, one of the reasons we're really interested in these totals,
Right.
is because we know how to get accurate estimates of the total, and then we can use these totals to benchmark performance across basins. We know we're getting all the sources in the basin, and this is key to, as we say, one of those early objectives. How do we track changes in emissions over time? Again, so one very specific use. These totals, of course, are not telling you anything about the specific pieces of equipment that are emitting, which is something that the industry needs to know to control it. But it's just part of it, right? So it's just focused on how do we benchmark performance and understand how this is changing with time.
So those are two of the products that we're creating with Methane Air and MethaneSat eventually, right, Danielle? And then the third would be like a breakdown of, like a visualization of the measurements through heat maps. Is that right? Or maybe I should just let you introduce
So
them.
exactly. So then the two other things we get is, and this so Grant, this starts to answer to your questions about spatial resolution, right? So
Yes, sir.
what we have is these wider areas where we get the total. In the case of the satellite, 200 by 200. But then the resolution of the satellite is actually way better than 200 by 200 kilometers. The resolution of MethaneSat is actually closer to 100 meters by 100 meters. So there's a lot of information on emissions within each of those 200 squares by 200 squares. So if you even go to the data platform today with initial data that's uploaded, what you're going to see is the totals for the regions, but you also see a heat map, which shows you where are emission hotspots, how they're changing across the region. And of course, that starts to be extremely valuable information to the
And
operator.
and is when I think 100 by 100 kilometer, that doesn't seem, that's a big area, and
Right.
so that doesn't seem like good resolution. Um, but then I also hear you say your really focus is trying to get the totals and not necessarily down to the specific locations
Well,
or the specific elite points.
so
Is that how you say that that's good resolution, or maybe, or is that good
well,
resolution?
it's I think it's good resolution when you combine the three types of data. Type 1 is the total for the region.
Right?
Type 2 is being able to resolve within those big areas what are the emissions, and we're resolving them to something roughly speaking of uh, a few square kilometers, right? So now you're going from 200 square kilometers to something like 5 square kilometers or even
Okay.
less than
Which
that.
sounds a whole lot better, clearly.
Right, and there's still a lot of things that can happen in a 1 by 1 square kilometer or a 5 by 5, but it starts to get closer to what the operators can use to act on it. And then the third type of data, which links to what other satellites are doing today, is we're also pinpointing distinct high emitting sources. So if within the Permian, the day that the satellite passed over, or when we were mapping with the aircraft with Methane Air, we saw this high emitting, it can be events or it can be a persistent source. Uh, we also detect those, right? And we say, I mean, and in those cases, it's relatively easier to do the attribution. The
It, but is it because if it's 5 by 5, or well, definitely not 100 by 100, but you 5 by 5 or smaller, it starts getting that way. But like in a very active area like the Permian or Appalachia or any of these, there could be multiple wells in that area. So the ability to say it is, this is the source, is that
Yeah, no, it's I fully agree with you, right? So it's relatively easier with these high emitting sources, but as you say, if there's
and
very
I guess that's true.
clustered,
If it's a really emitting, then it makes it a little easier to
yeah,
focus. So
and
it
that's
kind of,
that's why we're doing it. So that's why it's a separate data type, right? So you always are going to get the three. You're always going to get the totals for the basin or the region,
right?
the smaller gridded emissions of say 5 by 5 or even 1 by 1, and then the distinct point sources. And so this is important also because in we know that the point sources get a lot of attention and a lot of the coverage.
Right.
But what we often find is that depending on the basin, uh, in a lot of cases, it's not those distinct point sources that account for the bulk of the emissions. It's the smaller things that add up as a whole. So you want to know, you want to be able to know both to get the real complete overview of emissions.
And when you're looking at whether it's methane air or methane sat, it went to a presentation earlier that talked about wind and kind of other factors that had to be kind of considered to be able to. It's when you start thinking about it, it seems a lot. It becomes a lot more complex in how that, and maybe that's all within your algorithms and being able to kind of, and that's just to identify that you've got leaks, and then you're trying to create volumes, I assume, and you're, I guess, doing that because you're doing percentages, so you have underground or kind of backup volumes. Is that, There's
Yeah.
a question somewhere in there, if you could dig that
No,
out.
yeah, I follow you. Yeah. So I think what's interesting about what you're saying is, um, yeah, I mean it's it's a uh, it's a complex process to
Right,
go from what the satellite is directly measuring to what we actually need, which is the tons per hour, right?
right,
Uh, and I mean, the good news is that the process to go from measurement to tons per hour is very well understood. Not that it's easy, but it's very well understood. The scientific community has been using these methods for many years. They've improved how to do it,
okay,
uh, and we're leveraging that knowledge to build the algorithms. Where methane sat is a game changer is that, I mean, when I started using some of this satellite data 3 4 years ago, and we wanted to look to a place like the Permian, it would take us months,
yeah,
several months, to go from measurement to tons per hour. And so what we've done with methane sat is create automatic algorithms that reduce this process into days of so you really get closer to near real time. The other thing is, again, even though this is well established methods of how to do it and how to incorporate the meteorological conditions that you're saying and the different terrain and how it impacts the reflection of the light and so on and so forth,
right.
we want to make sure that our stakeholders and users of the data are convinced that this is data that can be trusted. And we actually think that this should be a requirement for any given monitoring technology, especially when we're having so many new technologies appearing.
I'm sorry, what should be a requirement? The
Thorough validation.
validation. Okay, thank you.
And so there's also a number of processes out there to uh, compare. So compare your quantification to a known control release of emissions, uh, that it's blinded, right? So the monitoring technology doesn't know what's the quantity, but they need to detect and provide an answer. And because you know how much you're releasing, you can compare the two and check that it actually works. So we think that validation should be kind of put forward as more technologies appear, and we went through it with methane sat. So there's a number of scientific publications that show how the methods behind methane sat are trustworthy. And again, building on this, it's useful to build the reliability for what is a new instrument.
The kind of the intriguing point of all this, because obviously methane sat exists, but there's I don't know how many other satellites that are
Yeah,
doing this. And we interviewed another person that Satellytics, that they use public sources and then buy that data and then do algorithms. So some have their own satellites, some don't. And so you start seeing all these different options out there, and then you have flyovers like y'all's and others, and it my little head blows up, because how do you compare and how do you see and
yeah,
how do you, and then you kind of have, and I haven't looked to compare to see if they're all within a certain band or if there's a lot of outliers. And but then but if that doesn't kind of come together, then it's like, of course everybody's going to say their satellite, their data, their algorithm is better. But how does that
yeah.
get kind of rigorously kind of figured out to see what you should really be using as a company or as a regulatory entity?
Yeah,
That that's kind of philosophical question in a way, or a
it is.
technical question. That's
Yeah, no, I think it is. And so let me answer it both from the perspective of satellites itself, because I think it's quickly becomes a confusing topic, and then we can expand to the wider monitoring options. But so in terms of satellites, what's interesting, what we see today, as you're saying, Grant, there's a number of satellites that provide methane data. The interesting thing is that it's they're not equal, right? So the data they provide is not apples to apples. Part of the
but the
reason,
but the neat thing is they'll all tell you that their stuff's the best.
yes,
So,
everyone
so
tells
for the
you,
layman like me or the oil
yeah,
company that's wanting to use that data, they don't know.
yeah, and
So,
and again, right? So I think in part I go back to one of my earlier questions, which I think if I was an operator, and I'm suddenly asking, okay, what type of monitoring do I need?
Mm-hmm.
I think the first question I need to answer is, what type of information am I looking for? Am I looking to identify leaks to fix them quickly, or or am I trying to quantify emissions because I need to report them to a certain entity? And of course, you want one technology to be the silver bullet to do both.
You prefer,
But unfortunately,
not
as you
like,
say, even though most service providers say that they do it, the reality is that they don't. And they end up being two very different objectives, right?
yeah,
And and so when we go to the satellite world, what we see is a number of satellites that we can call point mappers. What they do is you point the satellite to a known location. So you provide the latitude and longitude of your one facility to the satellite operator, and they will provide you a measurement of the emissions for that known facility. So if you know that if you only operate one facility, well, it's great because you know where to look for it.
it's a lot easier.
Uh, if you have certain indication of what your leaky facilities can be, it's also very useful monitoring because then obviously you can confirm that and provide information. But if you have hundreds or thousands of well pads, it starts to become difficult how you use that alone, because
Right.
again, you would have to be pointing the satellite over all of the different locations. There's another type of satellite that it's called area mapper, which is kind of the other side of the spectrum. It's just kind of collecting data across bigger regions and providing information of the whole rather than the individual. And with those two extremes, you can see how rather than comparing one to the other, to the extent that they come together, you can start using the information in concert, right? So you can start doing this mapping of the region, detecting hotspots, and then pointing a satellite to specific locations. And MethaneSat was designed with the goal of becoming this bridge between the two worlds of satellites. So because MethaneSat in itself is already doing both. It's mapping bigger regions and then providing more granular information to connect to follow up monitoring actions. So you can imagine a world where you detect emissions from MethaneSat, you know the totals for your region, you identify these hotspots, narrow down to say 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers, and then with that information, you could point one of these other satellites to that place, or you can take a drone or an aircraft or a ground crew to that specific location and do the more thorough assessment and root cause analysis that comes closer to what the asset managers need, which is tell me what to change.
Yeah, no, and kind of filtering it down to see, but then there's communication required through that, that y'all have this data. Now, I guess it is on a public domain, so someone could look at that, but I don't know if oil companies are doing that, but somehow you got to funnel that to the operator to see if it's a super emitter or if there's an issue. And, that,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
that's
I
a
think
challenge.
part, and it starts to talk about the different um, users we expect. But I think with industry, yes, the key would be how can companies link their own reporting and monitoring systems to MethaneSat, and so MethaneSat becomes one more layer in this multi-tiered approach to managing their emissions.
Kind of a slight uh, left turn on this conversation, because in your press release you talk about comparing y'all's findings to commitments uh,
Yes,
from operators, and then I also look at, well, you can also compare that to public regulatory data. There's a bunch of things you could probably compare it to, and trying to figure out what it should be compared to say, is it good or bad? Now, in your press release, you were saying some were just so high that no matter what you compare it to, it's not good. But then you start trying to say, okay, are operators responding in a certain way? how do you look at that?
Yeah,
You in the previous table, you kind of showed some of the comparison,
yeah,
but uh,
yeah. So, and Elizabeth, if we can pull that table again. So let me respond with one concrete example that I think will illustrate what we
please.
mean. Because I agree with you, Grant. I mean, you can compare to a bunch of very different things.
Yeah,
But so
and then depending on where that data came in, and some of these companies created commitments 10 years ago or five
right.
years ago. They made them, so you're
Yeah,
perfectly within your right to compare against them
yeah.
because they made them. So
Yeah. So one concrete example that I think we discussed in the press release is one thing we're seeing coming up in Europe is that they're setting up an import standard, and and it's still being sorted out. But what we expect is that they're gonna select a methane intensity. So again, emissions divided by percentage, and so they're gonna look at places where Europe is getting its gas, like the US, and and so what it's going to create is the need to, for every single of these regions, compare current emissions against this number, and and access to market is going to be based on that, right? So
right,
what we say in the press release is, if Europe were to take an intensity standard of 0.2%, and 0.2% is interesting just because industry itself some years ago committed to getting to 2.2% this decade. It's also the one that appears on the US methane emissions charge. So let's take the 0.2%. So one thing we see in the current slide with methane air data is that every single basin right now would be way above a 0.2% standard to get access to the European market. But then also, I think what we see that the data allows us to do is, as these basins start to reduce emissions, it will be important then to compare the different basins and benchmark performance. So I think that's why this becomes really interesting. The other thing is, which is interesting from an operator's perspective, is if you take any of these basins, right? So Permian, Uinta, any of those is obviously a mix of several companies and operators,
sure,
right? So in a way, these numbers represent an average of the performance across the industry. The industry is by all means non-monolithic, so there's a lot of changes in methane management and environmental management. There's different stages of the methane journey, and so I think what this data also does is opens the door for those companies that are leading in terms of methane mitigation to bring forward their own data in a transparent way to show that they're significantly better than these averages, right? So what the 1.9% emission in the Permian means is that there's likely to be several companies way, way below 1.9%
oh sure.
and several companies way, way above. So this data released in a transparent way opens the door and signals an opportunity for those low emitters to report their data in a way that is transparent and trustworthy to show that they're performing significantly better than these averages.
And to report that data, that would be. It seems like the only real option is through this, like for the Permian, through the Railroad Commission or through the EPA, through their filing. That seems to be the only standard out there. But so that's question one. And then
Yeah.
I've talked to folks that also say, well, you can't trust these people to file it, but but how else can you get that data? So I know that's definitely going off on a tangent, but it's
No, it's a useful tangent. I mean, and I think, and it's a very interesting topic for conversation itself. But to keep it short, I think what's interesting today is, one, we do see industry embracing methane monitoring and seeing the value, not just in terms of this transparency and accountability. They obviously see the value in that, but I think they also see the value in terms of using monitoring to go after the low hanging fruits and have a more efficient approach at mitigation. But then, from a reporting perspective, I think what's interesting is we now see a number of global standards and frameworks for reporting for industry. They're voluntary. They were co-developed by industry. The most important one is called Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, or OGMP.
Okay.
So it shows how a company approaches a journey to increase the quality of their methane data. And so through this initiatives, industry can start, and it's already reporting their data in a way that they can say, look, I've improved my data quality, and I can use this to show how I'm being serious about methane mitigation. So I think these frameworks allow companies to move forward with advanced monitoring and serious, transparent reporting beyond what you would see required in like state level regulatory or even federal level regulatory standards for reporting. Does that make sense?
It does. I might offer a friendly amendment to your comment about the satellite and all. I agree with you that it's increased. From my sense, that a lot of that's being driven by the super emitter issue and trying to have kind of be able to show that they weren't having leaks. And so there's a lot of interest out there of how to use continuous monitoring or flyovers to be able to kind of backstop any claim that they've had this super emitter issue that's gone forever into the back. I think that's a big driver on it also, as far as why they continuous monitoring flyovers are becoming even more and more popular.
Useful, right? And I think that's a really good point, and it speaks about where we're going with this journey, right? Because again, a lot of the first generation of satellites out there were just speaking the bigger of the biggest leaks, which of course one asks why are they there? And so as technology gets better and we start to see smaller things
Mm-hmm.
and they're released in a transparent way, I think this starts to keep playing out the way you just mentioned. Just a need to put
Yeah.
additional data forward to say, well, it's
You
yeah,
start highlighting the issues that you have with the data or with the monitoring, and then you start fine tuning to hopefully get a more accurate data set and ability to monitor. So it starts coming together. And so
exactly.
it seems like, I don't know, it's, you think we're in the third or fourth inning of all this because, or is like the methane sat, do you think it's like, will you have to put another satellite up there that does even better resolution, or you think it's going to be able to do what you're needing it to do to kind
Yeah,
of really
I mean,
narrow it down?
I think again, it depends on the question. What would be the
What do you use
objective
it
of a
for?
new satellite, right? I
Yeah,
think
that's a good
in
point.
terms of having a system that allows us to see that emissions are being mitigated and track progress, this will work.
Okay.
I think in terms of, do you need a satellite that has a level of precision to pinpoint valves? It's like, yeah, well, maybe you can develop it. Do you actually need to develop it if you can also use drones and right? So I think again, depending on the objective, there might be there's already a very reliable toolkit out there in terms of methane monitoring that can
Right. It's, like some of the tools you're talking about there, Danielle, are like the kinds of things you would do for a leak detection survey,
exactly
right? Like under regulations.
exactly
And that, I mean, you might be able to kind of combine methods to kind of fine tune your process as an operator. And, aside from kind of the bigger picture point that you've been talking about today about just like how do we as a society kind of grapple and get a handle on what are the actual methane emissions from these big areas? How are they changing over time? How are the efforts that regulators and operators are making to reduce their methane emissions working? Are we seeing, as rules get implemented, as more and more companies begin and learn that methane journey, are we seeing those absolute emissions and rates coming down in these basins? And eventually, you know, you may be able to like look at some granularity at the detail of the data of like where, you know, where are the hotspots in this particular kind of subset of the basin decreasing, or operators are replacing leaky equipment or starting up leak detection and repair programs that they may not have been doing over time. But for sure, I think, you know, for me, learning about all these technologies and in this role has been, I think, encouraging. And some, like, there are a lot of available tools and we've made a lot of progress. And
Definitely.
also they're not all, you know, one size fits all, right? You need, and that's good in some ways, right? Because I take your point, Grant, that it can be also overwhelming for people who are just trying to kind of process what,
Yeah.
you know, what information and what tools are out there. But it also, on the flip side, gives operators a lot of flexibility to design a program that makes sense for them and their resources and what they're operating.
No, Elizabeth, I think that's a fantastic point, and also probably a great time to end. As you could probably tell, I could keep talking about this. It's very interesting, the philosophical, the technical, it all kind of, and very important aspect of the whole methane mitigation effort that we're all on. But Elizabeth, Danielle, really appreciate y'all's time.